Hello, DF, long-time listener, but this is my first time writing in. I've always agreed with John that 60 frames per second is a design decision. There used to be a general sentiment that console gamers didn't really care about 60 FPS. However, this generation is the first time console players have had a real choice between performance and quality modes. We now have data during PS5 Pro release showing that around 75% of players on PS5 choose performance mode. Historically, console gamers never had this choice, nor did we have data to understand their preferences. But now that most gamers clearly prefer 60 frames per second, shouldn't developers start designing their games with that as a priority? Again, I'm going to come to you on this one, John. I think maybe there has been a bit of a shift that was maybe enabled by cross-gen. Opened the door to 60 frames per second, and it's kind of stuck about because people clearly like it.
I would say, he says, shouldn't developers start designing their games with that as a priority? I would say they already have. If you actually run the numbers and you look at all games released across there and try, I don't know the date on every single game, but a lot of them. And there's a lot that you can extrapolate from that. This is the first generation since the PlayStation 2 era where the majority of software is 60 FPS. And in fact, it's higher than that. Nearly every game released today is 60 frames per second on consoles, right? It's a gigantic shift from the last two generations. 30 FPS modes are actually kind of the minority here. You don't see them as much. They're still around, but in some very big expensive titles, but by and large, everything's 60. I think that's awesome. So we've definitely seen a big shift away from targeting lower frame rates now this generation. So that actually matches up. And I've always argued that even if you can't see, explain the difference or notice it, you can feel it in a way. It's the reason why I think a game like Call of Duty became so popular when it did, because it was one of the only shooters, big multiplayer shooters on consoles during the PS360 era that did 60 FPS. People may not have understood that it was 60 FPS, but when they actually played the game, they sure felt it. They knew it. It's this feels good. And 60 FPS is a big part of the reason why. And that they stuck to it. Most of the more popular games in the world, when you look at those numbers, especially anything on consoles, 60 FPS is kind of just they all run at 60 FPS for the most part.
Same with the racing games. Forza and Gran Turismo.
Yeah.
They dominated the field in that particular era, and I think the frame rate was definitely a key part of it.
Absolutely. That era, you're right. That was a notorious era for low frame rate racing games. Even Criterion Games, after the brilliant Burnout Paradise, had to drop down to 30 FPS for their Need for Speed titles, right? Which was just what a shame, right? But Gran Turismo and Forza, especially Forza, really stuck to their 60 FPS guns, and it paid off, I think. So, yeah, I've maintained that console players care more than people might have thought for a while. They can feel it. And when given the choice, I think most people do tend to go with the performance modes just because for games, it feels better.
Yeah. And we do have the data now to support that, thanks to Sony, right, Oliver?
We do. Most people, like this user is saying, 75% apparently of players on PlayStation 5 choose performance mode. That was indeed part of the telemetry that Mark Cerny brought up when he was introducing the PS5 Pro. He was saying players have this preference for performance modes, but they aren't getting the image quality that they would get with these 30 FPS quality modes. So why don't we give them the best of both worlds with PS5 Pro? That was kind of part of his pitch in that initial 9-minute video. But yeah, people clearly have a very clear preference for 60 hertz software. And I do think that most commercial games should aim to have a solid 60 FPS mode. There might be some exceptions like GTA 6, and I would have said a few weeks ago, Hellblade 2 would have been another exception, obviously. That's a title that's since been brought to 60 FPS. So perhaps that's less of a good example there. But I feel like the consoles are powerful enough to realize most game concepts at 60 hertz, whereas I felt in prior generations, certainly during the 360 generation, you really felt a big trade-off between 60 FPS software and 30 FPS software. There was a very, very clear divergence in the capabilities of a game like, say, Red Dead Redemption versus a title like
Right.
Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the original Modern Warfare 2, I should clarify. There was a very clear difference in terms of what you could achieve, the kinds of environments, the kinds of complexity. Also, just like rendering a big open environment, that was the kind of thing that you could not really do credibly at 60 FPS for the most part, right? You really needed that extra GPU grunt to realize those environments in a credible way, in a way that would seem realistic and plausible to people at that time. Nowadays, what we tend to see is not so much this epochal difference between that 60 hertz and that 30 hertz update. It's just a small image quality difference in so many titles. Like it's the difference between 1440p and 4K. In a title like Death Stranding 2, John highlighted that on PS5 Pro, there's barely a difference at all in terms of image quality, even though the only difference is in image quality. Even on PS5 regular, PS5 non-professional, there's still only a relatively small image quality difference between those two modes. I think that in that case, definitely the smart money is just to pick the 60 hertz option and just let it be, right? Not to really think about it too much, just because it feels so much better to actually play with that additional temporal update there.
Yeah, it is interesting that there is this kind of push against upscaling in the PC space with a lot of PC enthusiasts, but especially on console, you see just how much of an enabling thing it is for delivering really good performance.